Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Oklahoma. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1919, and the American nation was still reeling from the aftermath of the Great War and the devastating Spanish flu pandemic that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Oklahoma Territory, recently admitted to statehood in 1907, was experiencing rapid transformation as the oil boom drew prospectors, entrepreneurs, and families seeking new opportunities in the rugged plains and rolling hills. Creek County, located in the northeastern part of the state, consisted primarily of small farming communities scattered across the landscape, connected by rough dirt roads that became impassable during heavy rains. One such community was Drumright, a modest settlement that had sprung up around the oil discoveries, where farmers and oilmen lived in uneasy proximity. It was to this isolated corner of America that Dr. Edmund Ashford brought his family in the spring of 1918, purchasing a farmstead approximately 5 miles from the town center. The Ashford family consisted of Dr. Edmund, a physician of some reputation who had practiced in Pennsylvania, his wife Margaret, a former nurse, and their twin daughters, Constance and Catherine, age 7. The girls were identical in every physical respect, from the dark curls that framed their pale faces to the unusual gray-green color of their eyes. From the moment the family arrived, neighbors noted something peculiar about the twins. They moved with an eerie synchronicity, their steps matching perfectly, their heads turning in unison as if choreographed by an invisible conductor. When one smiled, the other's expression mirrored it exactly. They spoke rarely, but when they did, their voices blended into a single sound, making it impossible to distinguish which girl was speaking. The townspeople of Drumright, accustomed to the eccentricities that frontier life attracted, offered the Ashfords a cautious welcome, noting in their private conversations that the twins seemed inseparable in a way that went beyond normal sibling closeness, a way that some quietly whispered was not entirely natural. Dr. Ashford wasted no time establishing a small medical practice in Drumright, setting up an office in a building on Main Street where he treated the various ailments and injuries common to farming and oilfield work. The local newspaper, the Drumright Derrick, published a brief notice welcoming the family and noting Dr. Ashford's credentials, describing him as a respectable and educated physician whose services would be a valuable addition to the community. Margaret Ashford was mentioned as a cultured woman with nursing experience, and the twins were described as well-behaved children of unusual similarity. In those early months, neighbors and townspeople formed their impressions of the family through chance encounters at the general store, at church services, and during Dr. Ashford's house calls to surrounding farms. What they observed about the twins went beyond mere physical resemblance. Several residents documented their observations in letters and diaries that would later become crucial to understanding what transpired. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, who ran the general store, noted in her journal that the twins always entered the store together, walked through the aisles in perfect synchronization, and reached for items simultaneously with identical movements. More disturbing was their tendency to finish each other's sentences, though this description proved inadequate, as witnesses realized the girls were actually speaking in complete unison, their words overlapping precisely rather than alternating. Miss Sarah Whitaker, the schoolteacher at the one-room schoolhouse where the twins were enrolled, kept detailed observations in her personal diary. She recorded that Constance and Catherine never separated during recess, stood side by side during lessons, and became visibly distressed on the single occasion when she attempted to seat them on opposite sides of the classroom. The local doctor, who had practiced in Drumright before Dr. Ashford's arrival, old Dr. Morrison, examined the twins at Margaret's request and noted in his medical records that while both girls appeared perfectly healthy, they demonstrated an unnatural attunement to one another that he had never observed in his 40 years of practice. As the months progressed, Margaret Ashford was seen less frequently in town, and when she did appear, neighbors noted a growing pallor and a distracted manner that seemed to worsen with each passing week. The autumn of 1918 brought the Spanish flu to Creek County, and Drumright was not spared from the pandemic that was devastating communities across the nation. Dr. Ashford worked tirelessly, often going days without sleep as he traveled from farm to farm, treating patients with the limited tools available to physicians of that era. In October, the disease struck his own household when both Constance and Catherine fell ill simultaneously. According to Dr. Ashford's medical journal, discovered years later among his papers, both girls developed their first symptoms at precisely the same hour on October 12th, both registering identical temperatures of 103 degrees Fahrenheit, both complaining of the same severity of body aches and headache, both beginning to cough within minutes of each other. The progression of their illness followed an identical trajectory with a precision that Dr. Ashford documented meticulously, noting that their temperatures rose and fell in perfect synchronization, their symptoms intensified and diminished in parallel, and even their breathing patterns matched exactly. Margaret Ashford also contracted the illness, though her case was less severe than the twins. Dr. Ashford's journal entries from this period reveal his growing fascination and horror at what he was observing. On October 18th, he wrote that Constance appeared to be recovering, her fever breaking and her breathing easing, while Catherine remained gravely ill with a high fever and labored respiration. That night, witnesses who came to help nurse the sick reported hearing Constance screaming from her room that Catherine was dying and taking her with her. When they rushed to investigate, they found Constance, who had been improving, now showing signs of severe distress, and most disturbingly, she had developed marks on her back identical to the bed sores that had formed on Catherine's body, despite Constance having been mobile and not bedridden. Dr. Ashford moved the girls to separate rooms, but both recovered simultaneously 2 days later, their fevers breaking within the same hour. However, something fundamental had changed in the twins after their brush with death, something that would set in motion the tragic events that followed. The winter of 1918 into early 1919 marked a period of increasingly disturbing changes in the Ashford twins' behavior and condition. Miss Whitaker's diary entries from November onward document a transformation that troubled her deeply. The twins, who had always demonstrated unusual synchronicity, now appeared to move and speak as if operated by a single consciousness. They no longer finished each other's sentences because they spoke every word in perfect unison, their voices blending into one sound that witnesses described as deeply unsettling. Miss Whitaker wrote that calling on one twin to answer a question resulted in both girls responding simultaneously with identical inflection and emphasis. Even more disturbing was their exclusive use of plural pronouns when referring to themselves. They never said I or me, but always we and us, as if their sense of individual identity had completely merged. On December 3rd, 1918, an incident occurred at the schoolhouse that would lead Dr. Ashford to withdraw his daughters from formal education. During a geography lesson, Constance accidentally caught her hand in the door of the supply closet, resulting in a deep cut that bled profusely. At the instant of injury, Catherine, who was seated across the room, screamed in pain and collapsed. When Miss Whitaker examined Catherine's hand, she found an identical wound in the same location, bleeding as if she too had been cut, though no sharp object had touched her. Dr. Howard Bennett, a specialist from Oklahoma City who happened to be visiting relatives in Drumright, was summoned to examine the twins. His report, preserved in the archives of the Oklahoma Medical Society, describes a series of tests he conducted in January 1919 with Dr. Ashford's permission. Bennett separated the girls by placing them in different rooms, then administered stimuli to one while observing the other. When he pricked Constance's arm with a pin, Catherine cried out. When he showed a picture to Catherine, Constance accurately described it, despite having no means of seeing it. Bennett's report concluded with a statement that would haunt medical researchers for decades. He wrote that if his observations were accurate, the Ashford twins represented a phenomenon that violated every principle of medical science and human physiology he had been taught. Dr. Ashford's response to these developments revealed a man caught between scientific curiosity and parental desperation. Margaret Ashford's diary, which would not be discovered for decades, provides insight into the growing tension within the household during this period. In entries from January and February 1919, Margaret describes her increasing fear of her own daughters, writing that the twins watched her with an intensity that suggested they could perceive her thoughts. She recorded incidents that defied rational explanation, both girls waking simultaneously from nightmares and describing identical dream sequences about events and places they could not possibly know. Margaret observed that when she accidentally burned her hand on the stove, both twins flinched and touched the same spot on their own hands before Margaret had made any sound or shown any reaction. Most disturbing to Margaret was her growing conviction that something came back wrong after the twins recovered from Spanish flu, as if the illness had somehow altered them at a fundamental level. She wrote that she felt the twins could read her mind, knowing what she intended to say before she spoke, responding to her unvoiced thoughts with knowing looks. Edmund Ashford, according to Margaret's account, dismissed her concerns as the product of exhaustion and lingering grief over the death of their infant son 2 years earlier in Pennsylvania. However, records from the Drumright post office show that Dr. Ashford was corresponding extensively with medical specialists in Boston, New York, and even Vienna, Austria, sending detailed descriptions of his daughter's condition and requesting any research on similar cases. Margaret's diary entries from late February describe finding the twins standing motionless in their shared bedroom at midnight, both with eyes open but unseeing, breathing in perfect unison with an almost mechanical precision. In one entry, she wrote a line that captures her terror. "It is as if there is only one mind operating 2 bodies, and I am being observed by that mind through 4 eyes." As winter gave way to early spring in 1919, Dr. Ashford's interest in his daughter's condition shifted from concerned parent to obsessed researcher. Discovery of his correspondence with European scientists reveals that he had become convinced the twins represented an unprecedented phenomenon in medical history, a case that could revolutionize understanding of human consciousness and the nature of individual identity. Letters preserved in university archives show that several prominent researchers urged him to bring the twins to major medical centers for study, but Dr. Ashford declined, stating that he would not subject his daughters to the spectacle of being examined like circus curiosities. Instead, he began conducting his own systematic investigation into their condition. Purchase records from medical supply companies show that between February and April 1919, Dr. Ashford acquired unusual equipment, including galvanometers for measuring electrical responses, chronographs for precise timing of events, and specialized recording devices. A testimony from a medical supply salesman who visited the Ashford farm in March provides a description of what Dr. Ashford had created in a converted barn behind the main house. The salesman described an examination room equipped with 2 hospital beds positioned side by side, various monitoring instruments, and detailed charts covering the walls. Dr. Ashford's research papers, which were confiscated by authorities after the tragedy and eventually archived at the University of Oklahoma Medical School, document a series of experiments he conducted on Constance and Catherine. The papers reveal a methodical approach to understanding the connection between the twins. He measured their physiological responses, finding that their heart rates synchronized within seconds of being in proximity to each other. Their skin conductance responses matched when one experienced a stimulus, and their brain wave patterns, measured with primitive electroencephalograph equipment, showed remarkable similarity. One particularly striking experiment involved blindfolding one twin while showing the other a series of images, then asking the blindfolded twin to describe what she saw. The accuracy rate approached 100%. Dr. Ashford's conclusion, written in his research notes, was both clinical and anguished. The twins appeared to function as a single consciousness distributed across 2 physical bodies, their individual identities having merged into a unified awareness. The community of Drumright was not unaware that something unusual was occurring at the isolated Ashford farmstead. Pastor Thomas Mackenzie of the First Presbyterian Church kept a diary now housed in the church archives, that documents the growing concern among his congregation about the Ashford family. In March 1919, Margaret Ashford appeared at church alone, something she had not done since the family's arrival. She sought a private meeting with Pastor Mackenzie, during which she made cryptic statements that troubled him deeply. He recorded in his diary that Margaret spoke of her daughters as if they were no longer the children she had given birth to, saying they are not my daughters anymore, with a conviction that suggested either mental instability or genuine terror. The church ladies, that informal network of community oversight that existed in small towns, began visiting Margaret with offers of assistance and companionship, but they found her increasingly withdrawn and incoherent. On April 12, 1919, Sheriff William Dawson paid a visit to the Ashford farm in response to concerns raised by multiple citizens. His official report, filed with the county clerk, states that he found the twins in apparent good health, that Dr. Ashford was cooperative and gave reasonable explanations for the family's isolation, and that while Mrs. Ashford seemed overwrought, there was no evidence of criminal activity or neglect. However, Sheriff Dawson kept a personal journal separate from his official records, and in this private account, he wrote something quite different. He described an oppressive atmosphere in the Ashford house, a sense of wrongness he could not articulate. He noted that the twins watched him throughout his visit with an unblinking intensity that made his skin crawl, that they moved and spoke with a precision that seemed rehearsed, yet was clearly spontaneous, and that he left the property with a profound sense that something deeply wrong was occurring there, though he could not identify any specific crime or violation. A farmhand named Jacob Turner, who had worked briefly for Dr. Ashford in early April, provided testimony years later that shed light on what was happening behind the closed doors of the Ashford home. Turner described the twins as moving like one creature with two bodies, always in perfect step, always aware of each other's location and actions, speaking in that unsettling unified voice that made conversation with them feel like talking to a single entity rather than two children. Margaret Ashford's diary entries from late April 1919 reveal a woman descending into desperate fear and contemplating terrible actions. Her handwriting, previously neat and controlled, becomes increasingly erratic as the entries progress. She writes that she has become convinced the twins are reading her thoughts, that she cannot think privately anymore, that every intention she forms is immediately known to them. On April 24th, she describes an incident that pushed her toward the breaking point. She had been sitting in the kitchen, contemplating taking the girls away from the farm while Edmund was in town, not speaking this plan aloud, merely thinking through the logistics. At that moment, both twins entered the room and spoke in their unified voice. "Mother plans to separate us." She must not. Margaret writes that she is certain she gave no outward indication of her thoughts, yet the twins knew. She describes feeling as if she is being watched even inside her own mind, that no thought is private, that she is under constant surveillance by a consciousness that speaks through her daughters but is no longer truly them. Pastor Mackenzie's records show that Margaret visited him again on April 26, this time speaking more freely about her fears. The pastor's notes indicate that she spoke of either demonic possession or scientific horror, unable to determine which explained what had happened to her daughters. She told Mackenzie that Edmund had become obsessed with fixing the girls, that he believed he could restore them to normalcy through some medical procedure, and that she was terrified of what he might do. When Pastor Mackenzie visited the Ashford farm the following day to speak with Dr. Ashford, he was received politely but firmly dismissed. Dr. Ashford explained that his wife was exhausted and suffering from nervous strain, that she needed rest and perhaps medication to calm her anxieties, and that the twins were merely unusually close siblings who had developed synchronized behaviors. The pastor noted that Dr. Ashford seemed entirely rational and reasonable, making it difficult to credit Margaret's more alarming claims. Evidence from pharmacy records shows that Dr. Ashford had been obtaining increasing quantities of laudanum throughout April, ostensibly for his medical practice, but likely being administered to Margaret to keep her sedated and compliant. Margaret's final coherent diary entry, dated April 28, 1919 consists of a single line: "I know what I must do. God forgive me." The morning of April 29, 1919 began as an ordinary spring day in Drumright, but it would be remembered as one of the darkest in Creek County history. The first indication that something was wrong came at approximately 6 o'clock when the milkman, making his regular delivery route, noticed that the front door of the Ashford house stood wide open despite the early hour and the chill in the air. Finding this unusual, he approached and called out, but received no response. Looking through the doorway, he saw signs of disturbance and immediately rode to town to alert Sheriff Dawson. The sheriff arrived at the Ashford farm within the hour, accompanied by Deputy Harrison and Dr. Morrison. What they found would be documented in official reports, newspaper accounts, and haunted recollections for decades to come. Dr. Edmund Ashford was discovered in his study, seated in his desk chair, dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. A revolver lay on the floor beside him, and his blood had pooled on the research papers scattered across his desk. The positioning suggested he had shot himself, though the angle of the wound raised some questions that were never fully resolved. Margaret Ashford was found in the kitchen, also dead from a gunshot wound to the head, her body positioned near the table where breakfast preparations had apparently been interrupted. Evidence at the scene suggested she had died several hours before her husband, likely sometime in the early morning hours. However, the most disturbing discovery awaited the investigators upstairs in the twins' bedroom. Constance and Catherine Ashford lay in their separate beds, positioned identically on their backs, with their eyes open and staring at the ceiling. Both girls were dead, yet there was no immediately apparent cause. No marks of violence were visible on their bodies, no signs of suffocation or strangulation, no evidence that poison had been administered. Medical examiner Dr. Harold Cross, who was called to the scene, conducted a preliminary examination and found himself baffled. The twins appeared to have simply stopped living. Their hearts ceased to beat, their lungs stopped drawing breath, both at the same moment. Sheriff Dawson's investigation into the deaths at the Ashford farm was thorough and methodical, producing a substantial file of evidence and testimony that would be studied and debated for generations. The examination of Dr. Ashford's study yielded the most significant clues to understanding what had transpired. Among the blood-stained research papers on his desk was his personal journal, the final entry written in a shaking hand just hours before his death. The entry read, "I have done something unforgivable. I believed I could separate them, make them normal, give them individual lives. God help me, I tried to separate them." This cryptic confession initially baffled investigators until they discovered what lay in the converted barn behind the house. Dr. Ashford's laboratory contained recently used surgical implements, still uncleaned, along with detailed anatomical drawings of the human brain and nervous system, with particular attention to the brainstem and neural pathways. The implications became horrifyingly clear when Dr. Cross conducted detailed autopsies on the twins. His report, filed with the county coroner and preserved in the medical archives, contains findings that shocked even experienced physicians. Both Constance and Catherine showed evidence of recent surgical intervention, identical incisions at the base of their skulls, partially healed, indicating the procedure had been performed approximately 12 to 18 hours before their deaths. Dr. Cross determined that Dr. Ashford had performed a precise neurological surgery on both girls, attempting to sever specific neural connections in the brainstem region. The procedure, while executed with remarkable skill, appeared to have been intended to disrupt whatever connection allowed the twins to share sensations and consciousness. The immediate result had been the simultaneous death of both girls. Margaret's final diary entry, found hidden in her bedroom and initially overlooked by investigators, provided the final pieces of the puzzle. In frantic, nearly illegible handwriting, she had written, "Edmund promised he would fix them. He promised he would make them normal again. Tonight, he performs the surgery while they sleep. I begged him not to do this. If this fails, I will not survive seeing what I have done by allowing this. God forgive us both." Dr. Harold Cross's comprehensive autopsy reports on the Ashford twins were submitted to the State Medical Board in May 1919 and sparked immediate controversy within the medical community. The surgical procedure Dr. Ashford had performed was described in clinical detail. He had made precise incisions at the base of both girls' skulls, accessing the brainstem region where he apparently believed the neural connection between the twins originated or was concentrated. The operations had been performed simultaneously or in rapid succession, likely with the girls under sedation. Dr. Cross noted that the procedure itself was executed with remarkable surgical skill, the cuts clean and precise, suggesting Dr. Ashford had planned and practiced extensively before attempting it on his daughters. However, the result was catastrophic. Both twins died within minutes, possibly seconds, of the procedure's completion. What made the case medically inexplicable was that the damage inflicted on each girl's brain, while significant, should not have been immediately fatal. The areas affected would have caused neurological deficits, certainly, but not instant death. Yet both hearts stopped simultaneously. Both girls ceased breathing at the same moment, as if by severing whatever connected them, Dr. Ashford had killed something essential to both their existences. Medical experts from Johns Hopkins University were consulted to review the case. Their report, preserved in the archives, expresses profound puzzlement. The surgical intervention, while tragic and ethically questionable, did not damage structures essential for immediate life support functions. The deaths remain unexplained by conventional medical understanding. They concluded by stating that if Dr. Ashford's documented observations of the twins during life were accurate, Constance and Catherine represented a phenomenon that medical science was not equipped to understand or explain. The medical community found itself divided in its response to the evidence. Some physicians, particularly those who had not personally reviewed Dr. Ashford's meticulous research notes, dismissed the entire case as fraud or delusion, suggesting that the twins' synchronized behaviors were either coincidental or deliberately performed, and that their deaths resulted from surgical error rather than anything mysterious. However, those who examined the complete documentation, including the hundreds of experiments Dr. Ashford had conducted, found themselves forced to confront the possibility that something genuinely anomalous had occurred. The community of Drumright reacted to the Ashford tragedy with a complex mixture of horror, grief, and superstitious dread. Pastor Mackenzie delivered a sermon on the Sunday following the deaths, a sermon that was transcribed and preserved in the church archives. He spoke of the dangers of pride and man's attempts to usurp God's design, using the Ashford case as a cautionary tale about the limits of human knowledge and the risks of tampering with mysteries that should remain in divine hands. His sermon, while sympathetic to the family's suffering, carried an undercurrent of judgment that reflected broader community sentiment. The town found itself divided in its assessment of Dr. Ashford's actions. Some viewed him as a monster who had murdered his children in a misguided experiment, while others, particularly those who had been his patients and witnessed his dedication as a physician, saw him as a desperate father who had made a terrible choice, trying to give his daughters a chance at normal lives. Former patients testified to his kindness and skill, describing a man who had saved lives and shown compassion. But neighbors countered with testimony about the unnatural twins, describing the girls in terms that suggested they were somehow wrong, against the natural order, creatures that should not have existed. The burial of the Ashford family became an event marked by unusual circumstances. The funeral was held quietly, attended by few, as many in the community felt uncomfortable mourning deaths surrounded by such dark implications. Edmund and Margaret Ashford were buried in separate graves in Drumright Cemetery, but the twins presented a unique situation. According to witnesses who attended the burial, the twins were interred in a single oversized coffin, their bodies positioned side by side as they had been in life. This arrangement had been specified in a note Margaret had written weeks earlier, suggesting she anticipated their deaths or perhaps knew of Edmund's plans. Within days of the burial, reports began to circulate of strange phenomena at the cemetery. Multiple witnesses, initially reluctant to speak publicly for fear of ridicule, eventually came forward with remarkably consistent accounts of seeing two identical girls in old-fashioned clothing standing by the Ashford grave, always at dusk or twilight, always motionless, always together. These sightings occurred with enough frequency that Sheriff Dawson himself investigated, spending an evening in the cemetery, and according to his private journal, he too witnessed the figures, though they vanished when he approached. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, several aspects of the case were handled in ways that seemed designed to minimize public awareness and speculation. The official inquest, completed in June 1919, ruled that Margaret Ashford had killed her twin daughters through unknown means, then killed her husband and finally herself. This conclusion was reached despite significant problems with the timeline and the complete absence of any evidence that Margaret had the means to kill the twins without leaving marks. No poison was found in their systems, no signs of suffocation or mechanical asphyxiation, yet the official record stated she was responsible for their deaths. This ruling appeared designed to provide a neat conclusion to a case that, in truth, resisted any simple explanation. Many of the documents related to the case were sealed by order of the State Medical Board, with the stated reasoning that the unprecedented medical situation required further study by qualified experts. Dr. Ashford's extensive research papers, his journals documenting hundreds of experiments on the twins, and his correspondence with specialists were confiscated by the University of Oklahoma Medical Department and placed under restricted access. Throughout the 1,920 seconds, 1,930 seconds, and 1,940 seconds, occasional requests from researchers to review these materials were denied without explanation. The Ashford case gradually transformed from documented tragedy to local legend, the details becoming distorted through retelling. Stories circulated that the twins were demons, that Dr. Ashford's experiments had created monsters, that the abandoned farmhouse was haunted by supernatural entities. The actual documented facts became obscured by elaborations and inventions. Newspaper coverage declined rapidly, and by the mid-1920 seconds, the case was rarely mentioned even in local publications. The Ashford farmhouse and property remained abandoned, a decaying reminder of the tragedy. Multiple attempts were made over the years to demolish the buildings or develop the land, but each effort was abandoned. Workers hired for demolition or renovation consistently reported an oppressive atmosphere that made them unwilling to continue, describing a sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, always in pairs, always together. The property changed hands multiple times, each owner finding themselves unable to develop or utilize it, eventually abandoning their plans and selling at a loss. The Ashford case might have faded entirely into obscurity, if not for a discovery made in 1956. A construction crew hired to finally demolish the last remaining structures on the abandoned property was removing debris from what had been the main house when they uncovered a hidden compartment built into the wall of what had been Margaret Ashford's bedroom. Inside this sealed space, protected from moisture by a waterproof box, was Margaret's complete diary, far more extensive than anyone had realized. The diary had been carefully hidden, perhaps with the intention that it would one day be found and the full truth understood. The previously unknown entries from the final weeks before the tragedy provided details that had been missing from the official investigation. Margaret described specific incidents that demonstrated the true nature of the connection between her daughters, incidents that went beyond the synchronized movements and simultaneous speech that had been publicly documented. In one entry dated March 15, 1919, Margaret writes about asking the twins, who were in separate rooms, to draw pictures. When she collected the drawings, she found both had produced nearly identical images of a house neither had ever seen. Margaret later identified it as her childhood home in Pennsylvania, a place she had left before the twins were born and had never described to them or shown them photographs of. In another entry, Margaret describes deliberately thinking of a specific memory from her youth while the twins were in the room, speaking of other things. Before she could mention the memory, both girls interrupted their conversation to describe the scene she had been remembering in perfect detail, details they could not have known through any normal means. The entry that proved most disturbing to researchers was dated April 25th, 1919, just 4 days before the deaths. Margaret writes that Edmund had shown her his theory about the twins, believing their nervous systems were quantum entangled, a term that would not become widely known in physics for years, but which apparently Edmund had encountered in his correspondence with European scientists. According to Margaret, Edmund believed the surgical procedure might successfully separate the twins by severing the physical structures that mediated their connection, but he acknowledged that if his theory was wrong, the results would be catastrophic. The discovery of Margaret Ashford's complete diary in 1956 prompted a renewed examination of the case by modern researchers. Dr. Richard Morrison, a psychology professor at the University of Oklahoma, petitioned for access to the sealed records and was eventually granted permission to review the complete file. His 1957 article, published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, titled "The Ashford Twins, A Case Study in Unexplained Consciousness," represented the first serious academic treatment of the case in decades. Morrison's analysis of Dr. Ashford's experimental data employed modern statistical methods to assess the probability that the documented synchronicities could have occurred by chance. His conclusion was stark. The odds against the observed patterns occurring randomly were astronomical, effectively zero. If Dr. Ashford's records were accurate and Morrison found no evidence of fabrication, then Constance and Catherine Ashford had demonstrated a connection between their minds and bodies that violated every known principle of neuroscience and psychology. Morrison consulted with physicists at the university to explore whether quantum entanglement, a phenomenon that had been experimentally verified at the subatomic level, could somehow account for the twins' connection. The physicists' response, included in Morrison's paper, stated that while quantum entanglement was proven to exist between particles, nothing in current physics suggested such effects could occur between human consciousnesses at the macroscopic scale. The distances involved, the environmental interference, and the complexity of biological systems should make such entanglement impossible. Yet they could not explain the documented evidence any other way. In 1962, neurologist Dr. Susan Patterson conducted her own study of the case, focusing particularly on the autopsy reports and the nature of the surgical procedure Dr. Ashford had performed. Her findings, published in a neurology journal, highlighted a mystery that previous researchers had noted but not emphasized. The surgical damage inflicted on each twin's brain should not have been immediately fatal. Dr. Patterson wrote that each girl's neurological injury, while serious, was not sufficient to cause instant death. The structures damaged were not those controlling immediate life support functions like breathing and heartbeat. Yet both girls died within seconds of each other, their hearts stopping simultaneously. Patterson proposed a hypothesis that would be considered radical in medical circles. Some form of connection we cannot currently measure was severed during the surgery, and the breaking of this connection proved immediately fatal to both twins, as if they shared something essential that could not survive division. The Ashford grave in Drumright Cemetery has been the site of reported phenomena spanning more than a century, with documented accounts from numerous credible witnesses. The pattern of sightings that began in 1920 has continued with remarkable consistency into the present day. Throughout the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds, the cemetery groundskeeper, the local minister, and numerous visitors reported seeing two identical girls in clothing that appeared outdated even for that era, standing motionless by the Ashford plot. These figures always appeared at dusk or in the early evening, never in full daylight or complete darkness. They were described as translucent, or somehow not entirely solid, though their features were clear enough that witnesses could see they were identical and appeared to be about 7 years old. The girls never moved separately, always standing in perfect parallel, and they vanished if anyone approached too closely. In 1942, during World War II, the cemetery's night watchman filed a report with local police about hearing two child voices singing in unison near the Ashford grave during his rounds. He investigated, finding the cemetery gates locked and no living children present, yet the singing continued for several minutes before fading away. In 1958, an amateur photographer visiting the cemetery captured an image that would be analyzed by experts for decades. The photograph clearly shows two translucent figures near the Ashford headstone, identical in form, standing in mirror image positions. The negative was examined by photography experts who found no evidence of double exposure, manipulation, or fraud. The photographer, a respected local businessman with no interest in the paranormal, never sought publicity for his image and was reportedly disturbed by what he had accidentally captured. In the 1,970 seconds, a team of paranormal investigators conducted an overnight study of the cemetery, focusing on the Ashford grave. Their audio recordings captured what they described as two identical child voices speaking in perfect synchronization, saying words that were difficult to make out but were definitely not produced by any single source. The lead investigator stated that in 30 years of paranormal research, he had never encountered anything quite like the Ashford phenomena. In 1985, the cemetery groundskeeper made a curious discovery. On April 29th, the anniversary of the deaths, he found fresh flowers planted on the grave, two different types arranged in a precise mirror image pattern. No one had been seen planting them, and this discovery repeated annually for years. As scientific understanding of consciousness and neurology advanced through the late 20th century, researchers periodically returned to the Ashford case, finding in it questions that modern science still could not definitively answer. In 1978, neuroscientist Dr. Thomas Chen published an article titled The Ashford Twins and the Limits of Consciousness Studies, in which he reviewed all available documentation and interviewed several researchers who had previously studied the case. Chen, a skeptical scientist by training, found himself forced to acknowledge that the documented evidence, if accurate, suggested phenomena that current neuroscience simply could not explain. In 1991, a documentary filmmaker researching medical mysteries interviewed physicist Dr. James Wheeler about whether quantum theory could shed any light on the Ashford case. Wheeler's response was cautious but intriguing. He stated that while quantum entanglement between particles was well established, suggesting it could occur at the scale of human consciousness seemed impossible by all known physics. Yet the data from the Ashford case, particularly the experiments Dr. Ashford conducted showing instantaneous correlation between the twins' responses across distance and barriers, matched exactly what one would expect if quantum entanglement somehow operated between their nervous systems. Wheeler concluded by saying the case suggested these twins shared something we might call a unified quantum wave function at the scale of human consciousness, adding that this should be impossible, but the evidence was compelling. In 1998, a geneticist examining preserved tissue samples from the twins, samples that had been kept in the University Medical Archives, made an interesting discovery. Both girls shared 100% genetic identity as expected for identical twins, but the samples also showed unusual cellular markers in neural tissue. The report stated that cellular structures in both twins showed identical abnormalities in neural tissue development, as if their nervous systems had formed in unusual coordination, more interconnected than typical even for identical twins. In 2015, consciousness researcher Dr. Emily Strauss published a comprehensive analysis of the case, bringing together perspectives from neuroscience, physics, psychology, and philosophy. Her conclusion synthesized decades of research. The Ashford twins may represent the only documented case of two physically separate bodies housing a truly unified consciousness. Strauss proposed that some combination of genetic factors and the neurological impact of Spanish flu created unprecedented neural synchronization between the girls. The Ashford case has now been studied and debated for over a century, yet fundamental questions remain unanswered despite advances in science and medicine. What is known with certainty from documented evidence can be stated clearly. Constance and Catherine Ashford demonstrated measurable, documented synchronicities that multiple credible witnesses observed and that trained physicians tested under controlled conditions. The probability of these synchronicities occurring by chance has been calculated by statisticians as essentially zero, meaning something genuine was connecting the twins in ways that defied conventional understanding. Dr. Edmund Ashford's research data, reviewed independently by numerous experts over the decades, shows phenomena that violate understood principles of neuroscience, including the twins' ability to share physical sensations across distance, to access each other's perceptions without sensory input, and to demonstrate physiological responses that synchronized with precision beyond any known biological mechanism. The twins' simultaneous death following Dr. Ashford's surgical procedure remains medically inexplicable because the neurological damage inflicted on each girl, while serious, was not sufficient to cause immediate fatality, yet both hearts stopped within seconds of each other, as if something essential to both their lives had been severed. Margaret Ashford's tragedy deserves particular reflection. A mother who watched her daughters transform into something she could not understand, who felt her own thoughts were no longer private, who was driven by desperation and perhaps mental collapse to actions that resulted in the deaths of her entire family. Dr. Edmund Ashford's legacy is complex and troubling, a brilliant physician who documented genuine scientific anomalies, but who made the horrific choice to attempt normalizing his daughters through experimental surgery, valuing conventional life over the unusual existence they had. The questions that persist after more than a century of study are profound and disturbing. What exactly connected Constance and Catherine Ashford in a way that allowed them to function as a unified consciousness across two separate bodies? Was the connection a form of quantum entanglement operating at biological scale, a phenomenon physics says should be impossible? Was it something paranormal, beyond the reach of scientific measurement and understanding? Or was it something else entirely, a natural occurrence so rare that it has been documented only this once in human history? Could the twins have survived and lived fulfilling lives if left alone, or would their unusual connection have proven incompatible with normal development and social integration? Did Dr. Ashford's surgery actually sever a measurable but unknown connection, and was it this severing that caused their deaths, or did they die from surgical complications that merely appeared simultaneous by tragic coincidence? The phenomena reported at the Ashford gravesite present their own set of unanswered questions. Are the sightings of two identical girls genuine paranormal manifestations, some remnant of consciousness that survived death and remains bound to the burial site? Are they collective delusion, the power of suggestion causing multiple witnesses to perceive something that has no objective existence? Or are they something else? Perhaps quantum echoes of consciousness, impressions left in the environment by the intensity of the twins' connection and the tragedy of their death. The fact that sightings continue more than a century later, reported by witnesses with no knowledge of each other or the case's history, suggests something more than simple imagination or hoax. The current status of the Ashford property adds another layer to the enduring mystery. The land where the farmhouse once stood is now part of a state wildlife preserve, the original structures having finally been demolished in the 1970 seconds. However, park rangers and visitors continue to report unusual experiences in that particular section of the preserve. The most recent documented account comes from 2023, when a park ranger filed an incident report describing an encounter with two identical girls in clothing that appeared to be from the early 20th century. The ranger, unaware of the Ashford history, approached the girls to inform them that the park was closing, but they vanished before he reached them, simply ceasing to be visible between one moment and the next. When he later learned about the Ashford case from a local historian, he recognized the location of his encounter as being very near where the farmhouse had stood. Local guides who lead historical tours through the area advise visitors against wandering too far into certain sections of the preserve, particularly near sunset, not from any official restriction, but from personal unease and the accumulation of reports over the years. The question of what truly connected Constance and Catherine Ashford, what was severed when their father's scalpel cut into their brainstems, and why manifestations continue to be reported at their gravesite more than a century after their deaths, remains as mysterious today as it was in 1919 The case forces us to confront profound questions about the nature of consciousness and individual identity. Were Constance and Catherine two separate girls who happened to share an unprecedented degree of neurological connection, or were they something more unusual, a single consciousness experiencing itself through two bodies? If the latter explanation is closer to truth, then what part of that unified consciousness might have survived their deaths, and does it remain somehow present, watching and waiting in the cemetery where their bodies were buried together in a single coffin? Modern science, despite its tremendous advances, still cannot fully explain consciousness in a single individual, much less account for a consciousness apparently distributed across two separate brains and bodies. The Ashford twins existed at the extreme edge of human experience, in a territory where medical science, physics, and perhaps the paranormal intersect in ways we still do not understand. Their story serves as a reminder that despite our increasing knowledge and technological capability, fundamental mysteries about the nature of mind, identity, and the boundaries of individual existence remain unsolved. The isolation that enabled the tragedy, the remote farmstead where Dr. Ashford could conduct his experiments without oversight, the limited medical ethics of 1919 that allowed a physician to perform experimental surgery on his own children, mirrors the isolation that surrounds the case itself, standing alone in medical and scientific literature without parallel or explanation. The Ashford property is now peaceful, the wildlife preserve having reclaimed the land where such strange and terrible events unfolded. Visitors walking the trails are unlikely to know they are passing near the site of one of the most disturbing and inexplicable cases in American medical history. Yet those who do know the story and who visit at dusk might find themselves watching the shadows between the trees, wondering if they might glimpse two identical figures standing motionless in perfect parallel, two girls who died together over a century ago but who, according to numerous witnesses, have never truly been separated. Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Oklahoma. I invite you now, having heard this account, to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Have you encountered phenomena that science cannot explain? Do you believe consciousness can transcend the boundaries we assume separate one individual from another? The Ashford twins left behind more questions than answers, a mystery that deepens rather than resolves with the passage of time. Constance and Catherine Ashford were 7 years old when they died on April 29, 1919. Their lives ended by a father who could not accept what they had become, or perhaps what they had always been. Whether they were two girls sharing one consciousness or one consciousness experiencing itself through two bodies remains unknown. Whether some part of that consciousness persists, bound to the cemetery where their single coffin was buried, watched over by those who claim to see two identical figures standing forever together in the fading light, is a question each person must answer for themselves. Science still cannot explain what connected the Ashford twins, what was severed when Dr. Edmund Ashford attempted to separate them, or why they continued to be seen, always together, always identical, always moving as one, more than 100 years after their deaths. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, standing as reminders that the universe contains phenomena that exceed our current understanding and may forever resist explanation. The story of Constance and Catherine Ashford is such a mystery, a case that challenges our assumptions about the nature of individual identity, the boundaries of consciousness, and the possibility that death itself may not entirely sever bonds formed in ways we cannot comprehend. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of Oklahoma's most disturbing and enduring mysteries.